Okay, welcome back to the Performance Paradigm Mentorship. Today we're going to be talking about trunk training. Um, so this is sort of a topic I wanted to go over outside of the other presentations just because it inevitably comes up in fitness and there's not necessarily a very clear definition on it. But it certainly has an important role in training, whether you're training your clients or training yourself. I think it's important to be clear as far as what we're talking about when we talk about trunk training and how to approach it. So I wanted to start off with obviously with some definitions. This is how I always like to start off talking about topics. So what is the trunk, right? So the trunk can be thought of as the most central group of structures of the body measured from the base of the neck to the hips, right? So that includes um, all your muscles, the bones, your ribs, uh, and also all of your organs. That makes up the entire trunk, right? So it is the segment that forces originate from, but it is also where forces pass through. So I'm sure you've heard this at this point. If you're a trainer, when you generate force, it kind of comes from generating force from the trunk first, stabilizing that segment. Um, but it's also where forces kind of pass through. So when you're doing a squat, right, your forces that you're generating from your legs to stand up actually pass through the trunk. So if you have a relatively weak trunk or unstable trunk, it almost doesn't matter how strong your legs are. If it passes through your trunk and it doesn't hold up, you're not going to have a very good squat, right? So it's important to kind of remember that it also generates force, but it also acts as a medium and a connector from one segment, one region of the body to the other. So some of the basic functions of it is that it needs to stabilize as well as maintain a level of mobility, right? So I think people were very confused or just kind of took it to a very large extreme through various parts of fitness, various stages of fitness where people wanted to only stabilize and hold one position, or I think now we're moving into more just movement, indiscriminate movement. All kinds of movements are good for it, when in actuality, I don't know why we can't just have both. The trunk, just like most of our muscles, they play different roles during different activities, and they have muscles that do all different kinds of muscle actions, right? So eccentric, concentric, and isometric. And then you also have variations in like the speed of contractions. So you kind of have to do all of that. And so that kind of touches on the next point, in that the trunk is a three-dimensional structure, and therefore you need to acquire competency along all planes of motion, right? So you'll kind of see this with people that are barbell warriors, and they'll only be in the sagittal plane, um, or maybe even just the frontal plane. So it's kind of important that you realize that the trunk is also made to rotate. The body is made to rotate. More or less, all joints rotate, and the trunk and the spine is no different from that. So it's kind of very important that you account for these degrees of freedom that your trunk is able to execute whenever you're thinking about trunk training. And again, just like any other muscle or any other joint, it requires a variety of training methods, and it's also capable of performing different regimes of work. So it's kind of important that you include it in your training, you think about it in your training, and then you're also mindful of how you include it in there, right? So if you have a very specific goal like sprinting, trunk training is definitely very important as far as getting you to switch from left to right. This whole idea of the spinal engine, and like counter movements and things like that, it's all involved in the trunk, or starts from the trunk, sorry. And so trunk training is one of those where it drives, is one of the main drivers for effective sprinting. So whenever I talk about trunk training and stuff like that, inevitably this whole idea of a neutral spine or neutral trunk kind of comes into the picture. So I just want to take a second to kind of talk a little bit about it. Um, so neutral spine is just kind of this point of reference, really. It's not really an idealized position. Um, so the neutral spine is essentially maintaining a natural S curvature of the spine, right? So some people tend to take it a little far and totally flatten out all curvature of the spine, thinking that they're correcting for hyperlordosis or kyphosis, when in actuality, the curvature of the spine that makes this S shape is actually helps with load distribution along all the vertebral bodies, and um, the flattening of that actually ends up causing more stress along very specific areas of the vertebral bodies, which can lead to some irritation or just arthritic changes. So the theory essentially asserts that the S shape is the point or the reference point where the least stress is on the intervertebral disc, and therefore should be maintained if less stress is the goal, which we'll talk a little bit about it later, but stress in itself is not bad. It's just misapplied stress is bad. So in certain situations where you are dealing with a more delicate back situation or more sensitive back situation where it's the capacity for pain or not pain is very low, it may actually be smart to try to stick to a neutral spine uh, because it is less stress for certain situations. Um, the neutral spine doesn't account for load-bearing scenarios. So in the case of a back squat, when you have a barbell on your back, adding any implement like a barbell or a kettlebell will kind of pull a person or the lifter's center of balance either forward or backwards to the side if you're doing unilateral movements. Um, so in those situations, you kind of will have a reciprocal, almost like an instinctual shift in center of mass, and that neutral spine, that S shape, will change a little bit, just because now you have an external force that is acting on the body, and so they kind of have to correct themselves in order to just stay in balance. So this neutral spine theory doesn't really hold up when you're talking about any kind of lifting scenario. Also, the other thing I want to point out with these, like with maintaining or just being overly fixated on holding a position, a static position, is that if it is truly dangerous, then what we're looking at is every person that has ever played any sport should experience like a very traumatic spine injury, uh, if that's the case. So the other thing you kind of want to look at, one thing I wanted to bring up is like this fixed posture syndrome. So essentially the vertebrae and disc need movement to maintain health just like any other joint in the body. So joints, the way they kind of maintain their health and exchange of fluids is through movement. Um, Muscles and the like, when they contract and relax, they create sort of a pumping action. And so when joints, when they move around, they kind of have an exchange of sort of synovial fluid and things like that. So again, just trying to hold this neutral spine through everything is not necessarily the most healthy thing to do. So it's one of those things where you kind of want to encourage movement in a very safe manner, and getting out of this neutral spine is not necessarily the end of the world, right? So just like any other joint, you kind of want to maintain the capacity to move. Um, and our spine is actually made to rotate as well as have the ability to bounce back from compression. So maintaining both those abilities, basically giving them a variety of movements to kind of maintain that range of motion is key to sort of prolong health. So let's talk a little bit about bracing, because again, when we talk about trunk training, it's really hard to avoid this topic, and this is really where it comes up, this whole idea of bracing. And again, in the fitness industry, we generally have like two camps. I think one is more popular than the other. So the first one is the most popular one, which is just kind of bracing and holding positions, static positions. And then the other one is just sort of allowing everything to move, and all movement is good, to the point where you almost have, it almost looks like random training, which is not really, I mean, I have my own issues with that, but we can talk about that at another time. The whole idea of bracing is that you draw in air to pressurize the trunk, right? Because the body is essentially a closed system, and you create a rigid cylinder that can offer more stability. And the act of bracing is actually quite stressful on the spine, right? Because you're introducing air and you're increasing pressure in your in like the trunk. Um, but it also helps engage all the muscles around the spine to help stabilize it. So if you imagine sort of the vertebral bodies being surrounded by muscles that all attach to it, and when you brace and you contract all these muscles, they kind of act like um, wires that pull and hold that vertebral body in place. So sort of the cumulative stabilizing forces of the surrounding musculature plus the air pressure from bracing generates a lot of force in the spine itself. So this goes back to my previous point, right? So beneficial stress versus injurious stress, right? So this is the type of stress that is actually helpful. So yes, bracing does cause more pressure, um, but that's the kind of pressure that helps buffer out all of these sort of micro movements and instability that may lead to injury. So bracing in itself may actually be helpful for a lot of situations. Again, if you're dealing with somewhat of a delicate situation or a person that is injured, bracing maximally may not be the most beneficial, only because you are introducing more stress, right? So stress, in a sense, is um, kind of dependent on the context, right? So you kind of have to use your judgment, especially when you're dealing with someone that has a history of back injury or some sort of injury that you might want to be a little more careful of introducing stress. So I wanted to also talk about this concept of irradiation, which is kind of goes hand in hand with bracing a lot of times. And essentially it's this whole idea where you brace the trunk maximally with the intention that it will increase force production distally, right? So the force literally radiates outward. So kind of if you brace the trunk harder, you will therefore be able to contract and produce more force in your distal structures like your arm and stuff like that. And that's not always the case because there is also such a thing as overbracing, right? So the way the body works is you get a central motor command from your brain through your spinal cord through to your peripheral nervous system. And in that way, that's how you generate force, your muscle contracts and things like that. Now, with this whole idea of like over bracing is that you spend so much of your nervous signal contracting your trunk maximally that it actually takes away from the contraction signals for your peripheral structures or whatever else you're trying to do. And so in that way, you actually are not as strong, right? So you kind of have to be careful with this idea of just like, oh, you didn't lift that, you must not have braced as hard as you could. Sometimes that's not always the case. There is a certain contraction pattern and skill level to all movements. And as people get better, they get more efficient at executing that pathway, as well as recruiting and coordinating their movements to do that movement. So it's not always about bracing harder in order to lift more. Sometimes it's just getting better at technique and also getting better at recruiting and coordinating their movement patterns in order to perform an exercise successfully. So it's really important that you don't just default to bracing harder. The other theory that over bracing may actually impact or inhibit force production is sort of this like communication between the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. They kind of talk back and forth. So you may be sending a signal from your central nervous system, and then the peripheral nervous system will send a efferent signal back, and then nervous signal back, and in that way, it kind of informs that central nervous system what's going on at the end of that wire. Um, and so if you're bracing maximally already, your brain already perceives a maximal effort, and therefore its ability to produce more, a super maximal effort in that case, in that context, it's probably less apt to do it, and therefore you're also almost creating like an inhibitory effect on your contractions. So again, bracing too hard or bracing more is not the answer to some of these situations. So adding more to this idea of bracing, there are some things to keep in mind about the trunk, right? So you'll hear this cue a lot of pushing the stomach out or drawing in of the belly button. Um, what these actually do, and this is through like some EMG studies on people's trunk musculature when they do these movements, is while you do have some higher activations of certain muscles, they also tend to relax other muscles, right? So if your goal is maybe to emphasize one or another muscle, sure, that's like a perfectly good argument to kind of use these cues and try to execute these movements. Um, but if stability is sort of your goal, you kind of want a co-contraction of all the muscles surrounding the trunk to hold whatever, hold your body in place. So these cues may not be the best cues. Another thing that I kind of have against these cues is that um, the role of certain muscles change depending on the movement, the speed of the movement, but also the position of the body where the movement is initiated from. So in a deadlift compared to a squat, it's really difficult to say that one muscle in the trunk is more important than another, just because it's so context dependent. So why you would use these cues, you would have to have a very, very specific reason. If you can directly identify that there is a deficit in a particular muscle, then it would totally make sense to do that. But in general setting, it's probably best to just not use these cues because of you're not generating more stability by doing this. It's not actually how bracing works. The second point, loaded unilateral work causes more trunk activation than the same load distributed bilaterally. So if you're holding a 40-pound dumbbell on one side compared to two 20-pound dumbbells, one in each hand, um, the unilateral hold actually generates more trunk activation than the same load. So the reason I bring this up is because in the case of maybe you're dealing with someone that has some back issues, and we talked about maybe being more careful with the amount of stress you introduce to their bodies, it may actually make sense to kind of take that load and put it in half it and then put it in both hands. So in that way, you're not necessarily dealing with more trunk activation, right? Because you don't want to impose more compression stress on their bodies. So in that way, this is just something to consider. It's also another thing you want to think about when maybe you're doing unilateral lower body work, where the hips are kind of shifting and hiking from one side to the other when you are doing unilateral work. That can kind of cause pressure or uneven pressure and stress on one segment of the spine or one portion of the trunk. Just something to keep in mind. None of these are like hard and fast rules, but they're just extra considerations when you are programming for these things. You should be able to generate tension in the trunk irrespective of position or breathing patterns. So again, going back to this whole idea of touching base on the whole fixed posture syndrome, your body is made to bend and rotate, so you should be able to generate tension in the trunk when you bend over or when you extend, also when you're trying to rotate, right? And then while your breathing pattern definitely has an impact as far as how much trunk activation you get or how well you're able to brace, you should be able to generate tension irrespective of your breathing pattern. Or whether you breathe in on the way up or you breathe out on the way up, you should still be able to hold your trunk in rigidly if you're doing a deadlift, or if you're running around, right? One of the really easy ways to kind of do that is just kind of put your hands on your sides, right? And just kind of brace and then just have a normal conversation, and you should be able to feel tension in your trunk as you're talking. So that's kind of like a trick I use for some people that are dealing with back pain, um, is that I just kind of put my hands on their sides when they're laying on the floor, and then just kind of tell them to brace, and then just keep talking. We just literally talk about the weather or something like the Yankees or something. Um, and what that does is just kind of helps train like the bracing outside of these like fixed patterns. And so that way they can always find tension. They can always stabilize themselves regardless of whatever they're doing. Um, and so in that way, you kind of help train these things for them. But it's important to remember that bracing and trunk activation is not necessarily tied to like a specific position or a breathing pattern. So trunk training is general and specific, right? So what do I mean by that? So trunk training is general in the sense that, the trunk is central. Everything you do can be thought as a form of trunk training, because everything you do involves the trunk, right? So whether you're bending over to pick up groceries, or you're walking upstairs, or you're even sitting upright, your trunk is involved to some degree, right? So everything can be thought of as trunk training. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't be training it separately, right? So again, in the case of sprinting, right? Yes, it definitely involves the trunk. It definitely involves like your legs and even your arms, but it doesn't necessarily mean you don't train these things separately, right? So there's definitely like a specific component to it. And it's just, again, something to keep in mind, that your training may be very robust in terms of just moving the big rocks, but you have to kind of account for this specific or just sort of this extra training that you might need for your trunk, some added volume. So my second point to this is, I always get this question from trainers and also from clients, is like, oh, when is the appropriate time for trunk training? And as we said before, everything is basically trunk training. But there are some things where you kind of have to, like, your exercise selection basically changes depending on where it falls within the session, right? So explosive versus static, as well as rotational shearing versus compression tolerance. What that kind of means is, and this is just, you'll see this in every single training textbook or exercise book, you'll always start with the more powerful explosive movements, and then you'll kind of phase into like a more static and slower movements later on in your session. And that's because you're fresher and you're able to produce more force, you're able to brace better. Under fatigue, the tolerance of the muscles for work is much lower. So you kind of want to use all the things that will require a very high capacity, like explosive med ball throwing and sprinting, early on. So that would count as your trunk training. And then things that are less complicated and more static, less stressful, there's a lower rate of loading, or even eccentric stress. You want to save all those things towards the end of the session. So that kind of tracks with a very typical training session. The other point I wanted to emphasize with this is that, the spine tends to has a lower capacity to buffer rotational shear compared to compression. So you want to put all your rotational movements early on, and then all your compression movements that sort of compress the column down, up and down, sort of towards the later part of the session. And again, that kind of tracks with how people program anyways, But I just kind of wanted to highlight that so you're kind of aware of maybe why these things are structured or recommended in that way. And you're just kind of practicing safe habits whenever you're programming for your clients and thinking, oh, trunk training, right? Like maybe I don't want to do like a ton of med ball stuff after their heavy back squatting, right? Just because of that difference in rotational shear and compression tolerance. Resets for pelvic and rib positions, right? So a lot of times, this is again touching base back on like the whole fixed posture syndrome. People that tend to repeat movements, like barbell training and sports in general, are like man-made sort of things, activities that we do, and so we get really good at them by doing repetitions. And this kind of speaks to the human body's ability to adapt. Our physiology, and our bodies tend to morph or change shape slightly just to accommodate and be able to perform these tasks much better through repetition, right? So if you squat a lot, if you deadlift a lot, it's not uncommon to start to see people's spines start to change shape and their musculature develop in a very specific way to help them squat, deadlift, or bench a little better. Same thing with sprinting, running, and things like that. So trunk training in itself could also be like resets. So we kind of want to bring the person back into the other extreme, or sorry, more towards neutral. And again, not saying neutral is the best option, but in a non-load bearing scenario, we want to see that they're able to go back from one extreme to the other, right? So this again maybe touches base a little bit more on like just trunk control and body awareness in general. But again, you want to see that there's movement there so that we can help preserve, like maybe prevent some injury through preserving ranges of motion. And also, in the same way that like force production is affected by trunk position, so is mobility, right? So this may also have to do with it being so central. When you adjust someone's trunk position, there's usually a change in proximal mobility and ranges of motion as well, right? So again, just by adjusting the rib position and also some pelvic positions, you can all of a sudden have changes in shoulder and ankle and knees, and sometimes even neck. So in that way, this should be thought of as part of trunk training, where I am trying to preserve ranges of motion elsewhere, right? I don't think people talk about this enough, where injury prevention is also, well, trunk training is injury prevention to some degree beyond just stabilizing of the more immediate structures. Okay, take home points, right? So the trunk is a three-dimensional segment of the body and needs to be trained in all planes of motion. I think I kind of covered that pretty thoroughly, right? So you can kind of think of the trunk as a cylinder that is made up of muscles. And these muscles are capable of, many, many different tasks. They're capable of different sort of contractions. So they can do eccentric, concentric, and isometric. And also they're capable of varying speeds of contraction. And so if your goal is to have any kind of athletic development, it's really important that you try to kind of train your trunk to be able to tolerate these kind of stresses and also to be able to produce these kinds of different contractions at different rates. Again, you can kind of train the trunk just like you train any other muscle. It needs to have a variety of tasks, a variety of exercises in order to be fit for high performance. Bracing is more complicated than just blindly contracting and holding one position, right? So I think I touched on that pretty well, or went over it pretty extensively, where bracing and holding positions is not necessarily the end-all be-all of trunk training, right? So It's a little more complicated than that, and you kind of have to account for several different things when we talk about bracing and stabilizing. Um, Again, it's just one of those where you kind of have to expand your view of that, and your understanding of what the trunk is actually meant to do. It's never meant to just do one thing. It does everything for us, right? The last point I wanted to kind of keep in mind is program with tolerance in mind and goals that you're trying to achieve. So, you know, if the golden rule for personal training is do no harm, you definitely want to keep in mind that difference between rotational shear and compression tolerances, right? So we always kind of want to bank on the safer side, where we want to have a slightly lower volume of rotation or high speed rotation compared to compression exercises. Um, and also keep in mind people's goals, right? So if their goal is strength, then you're definitely going to need stability, right? So your trunk training is probably going to represent that. You're going to program exercises that are meant to stabilize or perform in an isometric fashion, like a lot of planks and things like that. If someone needs to rotate at a pretty aggressive rate and often, not to say that like that's all you're going to do in training, but you do have to have some kind of rotational component, and you also need to have some kind of rotational component at speed in order to adequately prepare your athlete for that type of work. Right? So when you're programming or when you're selecting different trunk exercises or different series of trunk exercises, you always kind of have to keep in mind people's tolerances, and also what their goals are and what their needs are, so that you can kind of make sure you address them, but also keep them safe. All right, I hope that was an informative presentation on trunk training. I hope it cleared some things up and gave you a lens to kind of focus your trunk training programs around. And I'll catch you in the next one.